What crime do you have to commit to get on Canada's most wanted list? Let's find out with the story of Albert Johnson Walker, also known as the Rolex Killer. Let's start on Sunday, July 24th, 1996. Two commercial fishermen start their morning as usual in a small fishing town in southwest England. They board the commercial fishing boat and cast out their nets to collect fish to later sell in the town. They head to what is called the roughs to cast out their nets. An hour later, they draw in their fishing nets to a bounty of fish. But among this great collection of fish, there was also a dead body. It was the lifeless body of a man who was fully clothed, but he had no form of identification on him. The fishermen couldn't tell who he was, or how he had died, or how long he'd been in the water. He was a mystery man. He had a few bruises on the side of his body, on his leg, and some sort of gash on the back of his head, but it was unclear if the wound came before he had entered the water or after he had entered the water. The fishermen brought in the proper authorities right away. How would they figure out who this mystery man is? Well, the mystery man was wearing a watch when his body was found. Not just any watch, but an Oyster Rolex watch. It turns out that Rolex keeps very detailed records of their customers who have purchased their watches or have had any repairs done throughout time. Each watch has a special serial number so the proper authorities could track down who the watch belonged to. This watch was registered to a man named Ronald Platt. The authorities tried to reach out to his next of kin, but they were unsuccessful. The only person they could seem to contact was his friend and business acquaintance, David Davis. David Davis didn't seem to be too upset or surprised about the news of his friend Ronald Platt passing away. Davis told the police that he was surprised, however, that Platt was back in England. He told them that he had invested money with Platt to start a business over in France, but he hadn't heard from him in a while. Davis complied with the police, answered their questions, and gave them a photo of Ronald Platt to successfully identify the body. The police were ready to rule this death a suicide. They were ready to close the case, but needed to follow up with the friend David Davis to complete the proper paperwork and put the case to rest. But Davis stopped returning the authorities' phone calls. So the investigators decided to drive up to Davis's residence and finish up the paperwork in person. The investigator drove over and knocked on the door, but it turns out he had knocked on the wrong door. An elderly gentleman answered the door. The police apologized and explained that they must have knocked on the wrong door. Before he left, he asked the old man if David Davis lived in the house next door. The old man replied, no, David Davis didn't live next door. Ronald Platt and his young wife and two kids live next door and own the home. The investigators were shocked by this news. Is Ronald Platt still alive and living with his wife and kids in England, or is he the dead guy from the fishing boat? So the investigators decide to look into this and find records that all of the bills and expenses over the last 3 years were being paid by Ronald Platt. It seems that Ronald Platt is somehow still alive. So the investigators determined that the so-called friend David Davis had stolen Ronald Platt's identity. He had been living his life as Ronald Platt for the last 3 years. So they investigate further into David Davis's past. They discover that Davis once employed a young woman who once dated the real Ronald Platt. It seemed that this woman and Platt had moved to Canada about 3 years ago, and Davis had funded the whole thing. However, once they were in Canada, things didn't go as planned for the couple. The pair eventually ran out of funds to support their lifestyle, their relationship had run its course, and the two decided to split up. After they had broken up, Platt decided it was time for him to travel back to England. And when he arrived back in England, he called up his old buddy, David Davis. So the two decided to meet up. David was going to take him out on a boat ride because Davis owned a boat. The two went out on a fishing trip on July 20th, 1996, just a few days before Ronald Platt's body was found in the Atlantic Ocean. It turns out that on this fishing trip, Davis ended Ronald Platt's life, weighed him down with an anchor, and dumped his body in the sea. Then he drove his boat back to shore, went home, and carried on with his life as Ronald Platt. The police discovered phone records from around the same area and time that they believe Ronald Platt died. How do the police know exactly when Ronald Platt was killed? Well, it goes back to the Rolex. The Rolex has a power reserve of 48 hours, so the police were able to roughly determine that Ronald Platt died on July 20th based on the time and date displayed on the watch when his body was found. David Davis killed Ronald Platt. So the police sprung into action and went promptly to arrest David Davis. They went to his home and he attempted to escape, but the police caught him and his young wife before they could flee. The police then search the area. They search his wife and they find that in her diaper bag, she was carrying diapers, thousands of dollars in cash, gold bars, and identification belonging to Ronald Platt. So they brought in the young wife for questioning. They conducted an interview that went on for hours, and eventually she cracked under the pressure and confessed that David Davis was not her husband. She told the police David Davis was actually her father. So she goes on to tell them that David Davis is not even his real name. David Davis is just another false identity. She told the authorities that her father's real name is Albert Walker. So who's Albert Walker? Albert Walker was originally from Paris, Ontario. He was a high school dropout, and he left high school and went on to have a long string of odd jobs. He was eventually hired as a bank teller for a trust company. He also began filing other people's income tax returns. And at this time, Walker began to settle down. He began a relationship with a lovely woman named Barbara. The relationship moved quickly, only dating a few months before tying the knot. And the couple got married, and then soon after that, they started a family. The pair had 4 children together in Ontario. Walker's family situation was great and stable, and he shifted his focus to his work. Walker eventually quit his job at the trust company and moved to establish his own freelance bookkeeping business, Walker Financial Services Incorporated. The Walker Financial Service Incorporated business became fairly successful. Over a decade, the company had grown to have 6 different branches and had about 30 different employees. But in 1986, a stock deal that Walker had invested in completely collapsed. As a mortgage broker and financier, Walker defrauded about 70 Canadian clients of $3.2 million, thus making him Canada's most wanted man. Walker was facing 18 counts of fraud, money laundering, and theft. To get ahead of the problem, in 1990, he decided to desert his wife, flee from Canada along with his 15-year-old daughter, Sheena. Walker and Sheena made their way to Harrogate in North Yorkshire to settle down, and there he had Sheena pose as his wife. Over time, Sheena had 2 children while living in Yorkshire, not from her father, but from an unidentified man. Walker then changed his name to David Davis and began a business career with television repairman Ronald Joseph Platt. Platt, raised in Canada, wished to return to his home country. Walker gave him money to return to Canada, but told him he needed Platt's driver's license, signature stamp, and birth certificate for the business. So when Platt left for Canada in 1992, initially with the intent of permanently settling there, Walker then stole his identity. Then when the real Ronald Platt decided to return to England, Albert Walker decided to take his buddy out on his boat, end his life, and continue to use his identity. But it had all caught up with him. The missing millions of dollars over in Canada, the murder, the lies, the deceit, it all came crashing down thanks to his daughter, Sheena. Sheena revealed that Albert Walker is an evil man and a con artist who manipulated me and lied to me just like everybody else. Walker was arrested on October 31st, 1996. In Teignmouth, England, in the spring of 1998, Walker's preliminary hearing was held in the village courtroom. On April 27, 1998, Walker pleaded not guilty in his murder trial in the English city of Exeter. However, at the trial, he was found guilty and received an automatic life sentence for the murder of Ronald Platt. Had Walker not been convicted, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office would have transferred him back to Canada to face his fraud charges. Later on, in February 22nd of 2005, the Globe and Mail reported that Walker would indeed be transferred to a Canadian prison where he would face additional charges of fraud, theft, and money laundering. Then, on July 23, 2007, Walker pled guilty and was sentenced in Kingston, Ontario to 4 years for fraud-related charges, bilking 23 investors, many of them friends, out of an estimated $2.3 million. He was also sentenced 1 year concurrent for the violations of Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. He began serving his life sentence in Canada at the Kingston Penitentiary in 2007. When that prison was permanently closed in 2013, he was transferred to a prison in the Canadian province of British Columbia. There were so many twists and turns in this story, I didn't see any of it coming. Definitely not your typical true crime murder case. This was an interesting one for sure. This guy almost got away with the murder of Ronald Platt. If those two fishermen didn't choose the exact location on that day to cast their nets that morning, then his body would still be in the water and nobody would even know he was missing. That's nuts. Also, I think it's just super weird and random that Walker made his daughter pose as his wife. I mean, it seems entirely unnecessary to the whole plan. Like, what was the significance of that? Well, what do you guys think of Albert Walker's true crime case? Let me know in the comments below. I'm Jason, and thanks for watching Killer Bites.